New Orleans, 1918. The city pulses with jazz, reckless energy, and a creeping wartime dread. But beneath the music and the magnolias, something far darker is stirring, something that will terrorize an entire city for over a year. On the morning of May 23, 1918, neighbors discovered an Italian grocer and his wife gravely injured inside their home. A panel in the back door had been chiseled out. It was a method that would become terrifyingly familiar. Within weeks, more attacks followed, each bearing the same chilling signature. New Orleans was gripped by fear. The press gave the unknown assailant a name that would endure for over a century: the Axeman. To this day, no one knows the true identity of the Axeman of New Orleans. No suspect was ever conclusively identified. What investigators could piece together came not from the killer's face, but from his patterns. The Axeman's victims were overwhelmingly Italian-American grocers and their families. This targeting suggested the attacks were not random. They were deliberate, possibly rooted in ethnic prejudice or criminal enterprise. Some theorized the Axeman was connected to the mafia, that the attacks were extortion-related, targeting grocers who refused to pay protection money. New Orleans had a long, documented history of Black Hand intimidation tactics against Italian immigrants. Others believed the Axeman was a lone predator, a sadistic individual who struck under cover of darkness and vanished without a trace. His ability to enter locked homes undetected suggested a cunning, possibly experienced intruder. What made the Axeman uniquely unsettling was his apparent desire for notoriety. In March 1919, a letter, allegedly from the killer himself, was published in the Times-Picayune. It was theatrical, mocking, and deeply disturbing. The letter claimed the Axeman was a supernatural entity, a demon who walked among the living. He declared that on the coming Tuesday night he would pass through the city. Any home playing jazz music, he wrote, would be spared. Between May 1918 and October 1919, investigators linked at least 8 separate attacks to the Axeman. Some researchers believe earlier incidents dating back to 1911 may also be connected, potentially extending the spree to a dozen or more. The first widely recognized attack came on May 23, 1918, when grocer Joseph Maggio and his wife were found gravely harmed in their home. A chisel and an implement from their own shed had been left behind at the scene. A disturbing pattern emerged at each scene. Investigators consistently found a panel removed from a rear door, chiseled out with precision. The perpetrator's own tools were rarely used. Instead, implements belonging to the victims were found nearby. In June 1918, a baker delivering bread discovered another grocer and his wife injured in their residence. Once again, a door panel had been cut away. Once again, nothing of significant value had been stolen. The attacks continued through the summer and fall. In August, a young woman reported waking to find a dark figure looming in her bedroom. She screamed, and the intruder reportedly fled into the night. She survived, shaken but physically unharmed. By early 1919, the city was in a state of collective terror. Hardware stores reported surging sales of firearms. Families barricaded their doors. Vigilante groups patrolled Italian neighborhoods, sometimes falsely accusing innocent residents. The attacks were not always fatal. Several victims survived and were able to give limited descriptions, but accounts varied widely. Some described a tall, heavy-set figure. Others recalled a slight, agile shadow. No consistent portrait ever emerged. The final attack attributed to the Axeman occurred on October 27, 1919, when grocer Mike Pepitone was found by his wife. After that night, the attacks simply stopped. The Axeman vanished as suddenly and inexplicably as he had appeared. The New Orleans Police Department was overwhelmed. In 1918, the force lacked forensic science capabilities that even a decade later would become standard. There were no fingerprint databases, no blood typing, no centralized criminal record system. Detectives focused on the consistent method of entry, the chiseled door panel. This suggested someone with knowledge of the home's construction, possibly a carpenter, a contractor, or someone who had studied these residences beforehand. Investigators noted that nothing of significant value was taken from most scenes. Safes and cash boxes were often left untouched. This ruled out conventional burglary and pointed toward a far more disturbing motivation. Several suspects were arrested and questioned. After the Maggio attack, Joseph's brothers Andrew and Jake were briefly detained, as a blood-stained razor was reportedly found nearby. Both were eventually released without charges. In one case, a man named Louis Bissumer was arrested after being found at the scene alongside his partner. Despite being a victim himself, he was charged and put on trial. A jury acquitted him in less than 10 minutes. The Axeman's letter to the Times-Picayune became a critical piece of evidence. Analysts studied its language, tone, and cultural references. Some believed it was written by an educated person, mimicking the style of Jack the Ripper's infamous correspondence. Despite hundreds of tips, dozens of interrogations, and round-the-clock patrols in Italian neighborhoods, investigators could not build a definitive case against any single suspect. The trail grew cold, and the department quietly moved on. No arrest was ever made in the Axeman case, but that hasn't stopped investigators and historians from proposing suspects over the past century. Several names have emerged, each with tantalizing but ultimately inconclusive connections. One prominent theory centers on Joseph Mumfre, a man with a criminal record who was reportedly shot and killed in Los Angeles in 1920, allegedly by the widow of the Axeman's final victim, Mike Pepitone. However, modern researchers have struggled to verify Mumfre's existence in official records. Some historians now believe the Mumfre story may be apocryphal, a legend that grew around an unsolved mystery hungry for resolution. Other theories implicate members of the New Orleans Mafia, who allegedly used the attacks as a cover for extortion campaigns against Italian grocers. The consistent targeting of that community lends some weight to this hypothesis. A more recent theory, proposed by author William Griffith, suggests the Axeman may have been a man named Joseph Davy, a barber with alleged mafia ties and a documented criminal history in New Orleans during the exact period of the attacks. Despite compelling theories, the Axeman of New Orleans remains officially unidentified. No confession was ever obtained. No forensic evidence conclusively linked any individual to the crimes. The case file remains open. Without a confirmed suspect, there was never a trial for the Axeman's crimes. This case stands as one of the most significant unsolved serial crime sprees in American history, a wound that never received the closure of a courtroom verdict. The justice system did intersect with the case in troubling ways. Several innocent people were accused, arrested, and subjected to trial based on circumstantial evidence and ethnic prejudice. The Italian-American community bore a disproportionate burden of suspicion. Louis Bissumer spent 9 months in jail before his acquittal. Yolando Giordano and his elderly father were convicted of an attack, then later exonerated when the sole witness, a young child, recanted her testimony under scrutiny. The Giordano case is particularly haunting. A father and son were nearly destroyed by a system desperate for answers. Their eventual release underscored how panic and prejudice can corrupt the pursuit of justice. If the Mumfre story is true, that the final victim's widow tracked him to Los Angeles and shot him, then justice may have come outside the courtroom, delivered not by the state, but by grief and rage. But even that story remains unverified. The uncomfortable truth is that the Axeman of New Orleans may have lived out a full life, never answering for his crimes. In this case, justice was not merely delayed, it was denied entirely. The Axeman's most bizarre legacy may be what happened on the night of March 19, 1919, the date his letter promised he would strike again. That night, every dance hall, club, and parlor in New Orleans erupted with jazz music. The city played for its life. Composer Joseph John de Villa even wrote a song called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, which became a local sensation. Fear had been transmuted into music, a uniquely New Orleans response to terror. The case exposed deep fractures in New Orleans society, the vulnerability of immigrant communities, the limitations of early policing, and the terrifying ease with which panic could lead to wrongful accusations. The victims of the Axeman, the Maggios, the Cortimglias, the Pepitones, and others, were working families. Immigrants who had built lives and businesses in a new country only to be targeted in the most intimate of spaces, their own homes. Over a century later, the Axeman of New Orleans endures as one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a ghost story woven into the very fabric of a city that refuses to stop playing music, even in its darkest hours. The Axeman of New Orleans was never identified, never caught, never tried. Over a century later, his victims' names remain etched in history, while his own has been swallowed by the dark. A new case drops every day. Subscribe so you never miss one.